Not yet.
Okay. Do we, it's okay, so we're dealing with the social movements, and what we see in the Monday session was the effort to, in the field, started with case studies, individual instances of reactions against a nuclear reactor, of a dam, of flooding. And often these took the form of a social movement, but not organized by a political party, which is the normal definition of lots of politics. Instead, because these tend to be issues which are not stressed by political parties, the normal parties, these new issues, women, the environment, human rights, which surfaced especially as major issues in the 1970s and got the name New Social Movements. These now continue in what's called diversity, combined with a new, more turbulent, diverse, and complicated form of politics, which includes aspects of parties. And so what I'm going to do is introduce a bigger framework that builds on it and it extends what we saw in the comparative framework on Monday. That is, we saw in McAdam et al. These three dimensions of opportunity structure, of the organization, and of framing, those three. For sure, those are excellent beginnings, foundations for comparing social movements and a lot of other things. But they're not enough. They don't tell us where these tend to work across historical time periods or how the US may be more unique. And so if we bring in these, we can then also try to add some propositions or beginnings of ideas toward propositions about where and how patterns differ in conjunction with the context. And so we have a mixture of case study evidence, of historical materials, of course, and videos and more. So we showed the video on Monday of Jane Byrne, mayor of Chicago, moving to the main public housing project, Cabrini Green, trying to celebrate an Easter with gospel music, with her speech, with singing of classic songs. And then her presentation was essentially interrupted by, Jane Byrne tricks. Jane Byrne is more tricks. So that is, a social movement was visibly protesting her in her looked as if it was her created context, her scene. But in fact, it turned into a battle between the police, the residents of public housing there, others, we don't know quite where they may have come from. But let me add then a more general point with Chicago and more broadly. She had been elected as co-chair of the Cook County Democratic Party with Daley One. She had been the commissioner of consumer affairs in the government, but she ran as a reformer. That is, she ran and said, I'm going to have new issues. We're really going to change things. We're going to make it better. We're going to bring reform to Chicago. But in fact, she raised more money through clientelist practices, selling off, giving away big deals for people who made large contributions to her campaign chest. She raised more money in her campaign chest than anybody, I think, before or since, certainly than before. That was seen and in the protest that we saw in the video, and others who led this across Chicago included especially Dorothy Tillman and then Jesse Jackson. Who were they? They were two people who had been key leaders under Martin Luther King in the South with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and they had been so successful with the civil rights movement, which is African American, that they wanted to go north and bring the messages of greater equality, less racial discrimination, etc., to northern cities where clearly there were lots of racial problems. And so their northern tour, they checked out New York, Chicago, LA, other places, and said, we're going to choose Chicago because it's the worst, the biggest, the baddest, the toughest political machine. And if we can crack Chicago, you know, it'll go over everywhere. And what happened? They lost. Daley completely triumphed. And when they arrived, there was no Black church that would take them in. All the Black churches in Chicago were committed to Daley, heavily because of traditional clientelism and so forth. They stayed in a white-led church. Tillman and others, the organizers, they started protests. They tried to do the kinds of things they did in the South. They lost. For 20 years, they then basically organized, roughly 20 years. They were organizing different protests, looking for ways of trying to challenge and transform this machine-dominated city. And when they had Jane Byrne as mayor, they saw huge potential. That is, there were things that were changing nationally, internationally. Within Chicago, citizens were getting more and more educated. There were more cosmopolitan residents at different neighborhoods. So in the 20th century, only Hyde Park and a couple of near North Side areas, Lincoln Park, tended to support reform candidates in the city council. All the rest was basically the machine. This changed as gradually you got more and more highly educated, more reform-oriented residents around Chicago neighborhoods, especially the North Side, north of Lincoln Park, around that area. And the Jane Byrne mayoralty thus was really focused on, in these continuing efforts by Tillman, an effort to look for things like what you saw in the video. That is, they would help organize a demonstration against a speech by the mayor, against the head of the school board, against a city council activity, against the police. So they would look for things which would have these elements of social movements, of new social movements. Because the party was against them, clearly they were a new social movement in that sense. But they weren't totally new, of course. They'd had a lot of experience in the South. The transformation came near the end of the well, okay, let me add one big one. What was also a critical, what anybody else know from reading or your knowledge of a couple of other critical things that might have brought down Jane Byrne and paved the way for Harold Washington? How did Harold Washington, the mayoral candidate of Dorothy Tillman, Jesse Jackson, and others, how could they possibly beat the political machine? How could they beat the Irish Catholic dominant style of clientelism, et cetera, when she had more money in her campaign chest than the Daleys ever had? How could she have done it? Anybody want to add a factor or two, or just a simple thing to add which are critical? Think comparatively, if you think of anything like this. That is, after this, we had more and more and more. That is, we live with this now all the time. Kiev, Cairo, Hong Kong, Washington, US Congress in January. These are new social movements of various sorts. They're not organized by in a traditional manner. So what led to Jane Byrne's loss, Harold Washington's victory, that Donald Trump did not have? That is, why did he lose? And why did Harold Washington win? African Americans were about 40% of the population. So if you just had straight ethnic voting, that wouldn't have done it. Okay, one big factoid, if you will, was we had very ambitious Irish Catholics, politicized in Bridgeport as sort of the leading area. And we had Jane Byrne, Irish Catholic, as mayor, and a very aggressive critical of her son of Mayor Daley I, Mayor Daley II. And so in this election, we had both Jane Byrne running for re-election and Daley II running for his election, and Harold Washington. So the Irish Catholics split the white Catholic vote, and they each had about 33 1/3. But Harold had about 2 votes more, so he won the primary election, the election in the Democratic Party primary, which is the critical election in Chicago, which is almost everybody's Democrat in Chicago in local elections. Then there was lots of organized activity. After he won the nomination, Bill Grimshaw and Jackie Grimshaw, who were my co-editors and co-workers on the Harold Washington oral history, which we started at that point, they had things on King Drive, where I live right here. They'd block all the traffic, and people would start to honk and say, stop, let the traffic go. And so they would do things a little bit the way you saw in Bogota. They didn't have mimes, but they had music, they had singing, they had dancing. And one of the big slogans was, "Come alive, October 5." And October 5 was the date of the general election. And so the Black media were particularly important, radio shows, talk shows. African Americans were 40% of the population. But what was their turnout? About 20%, a little over 20%. The turnout of some others was much lower. And one classic explicit rule of the game was you get patronage jobs and contracts and money in proportion to the number of voters who turn out in your ward. If you're a precinct captain or you're a ward committeeman of the Democratic Party, you don't have anybody turning out. You don't get many jobs to give out to your supporters. And so the normal answer was Blacks they don't turn out, they don't vote, so they lose. In the election for Harold Washington, turnout was over 80% for African Americans. It jumped from 20 to 80% because of these kinds of new social movement activities, excitement, music, dancing, cheering, etc. And that is what makes these media important. We didn't have new social media then. People didn't have cell phones, but they had radio talk shows and they had other things going on, and the style evolved and was increasingly influenced in the direction we have now. Okay, I'm using this major case, because Chicago is the most studied city in the world. People in Norway, people in Hong Kong know about Chicago politics. There's so many books written about it, so many people, and because it was so nasty and bad and racist and tough and so forth. Max Weber said, it's a city with its skin cut off. You can see all these nasty things out front. And so the with that background of Chicago, what if we turn to Sharon, if you could give us, please, the PowerPoint that I mentioned. Is that available? And it's on our. It's the top item in the week 3. It says on Canvas, types of activities. This is what we've developed over the years in conjunction with this. I mentioned that this book, the third sector, moved in that same direction, but the third sector includes many tightly organized groups. What I pointed out was there's a movement away from these. Okay, that's great. And we don't have any singing or any dancing, and unfortunately you can, if anybody wants to try to add to it, that would be great. Scroll just, let's see, is that the, yeah, okay, this is right. We got the headings here. So we have over here on the left-hand side, the kind of general political system we're in. We go all the way back to the feudal era of medieval Europe. Then we look at the type of action group which dominated the feudal era, and it was the master and his followers. The background and tightness of the arrangements linking them included the lord and peasants, multi-generational, that is, this went from father to son to grandson. Peasants in places like France and Germany could not leave. You couldn't leave the farm owned by your patron. If you tried to, you could run away, the way runaway slaves did from the American South. And there were cities that were trying to attract people away from the peasantry, which grew more important over time. But nevertheless, the ideal was the same many generations. And that in turn implied, and to varying degrees, that the Lord would take care of your children and your grandchildren. There was no welfare state. There was no serious state at that point. So individual obligations and support were seen as critical, and were critical. Incentives, job, you got a job. You got to be a peasant, you got to farm the land, you had full life support, you had private goods. People would give you a home, or if not a full home, incentives that would help you have a home in the area of your patron. And this would follow, however, the principle of strict hierarchy. Normally there was one boss and the followers followed the boss. Organizations and resources, personal contacts, closed. There was no market for people to work the land. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no right to move to the next parcel of land instead. Okay, so let's then contrast this. This is obviously an ideal type in the Max Weber sense, but it gives us a sense of what we're looking here at. What were the kinds of political organizational movements that changed? And I'm adding this. Let me just add, while we're on feudal here, as I mentioned before, what's the deepest political cleavage in the US today as measured by voting? Black, white. African Americans vote for the Democratic Party. That cleavage is a feudal cleavage. So even though we will next go to industrial and then later stages, we have feudal cleavages in Illinois, in Chicago, in neighborhoods where I live in Bronzeville. Bronzeville exists because of the feudal institution of slavery. Even though it was officially abolished in 1865 in the US, its residues are still with us. Okay, the next big category is industry, basically the Industrial Revolution. This in turn, at the end, or after, in the end of the 19th century, for the most part, led to, well, beginnings with loose associations, then they got to be unions. And here we had Just make this a little larger for me to see it here. Owners, managers, that's good, thank you. Owners, managers versus the workers. It was job specific. Instead of clientelism and patronage, the ideal, especially for Marx, was conflict, class conflict. You try to overthrow the capitalistic leadership of this pattern, and you would build up through incentives, but the owners and managers would in turn try to maintain maybe a company union or a company association, which would preserve the hierarchy around work. So you'd have in Germany in this period, for instance, there's a fine study of why do we have people living next to factories in German cities initially, and then Eastern Europe, Russian cities, and Chinese cities. This was a policy that was debated over around 1880, 1890 in Germany by the mayors of those cities, one. Two, by the owners, the capitalist owners of the main agricultural, but especially this is industrial, especially new factories, which because they were traditional, this was traditionally agricultural, but you had these new factories. And the new thought they could preserve the hierarchy better and have, if people really were working for them. So people would think, you know, if I'm depending on this man and this job for my salary and for everything, I better follow what he says politically and in other ways. And so the idea, so one of the dependent variables here was where did the workers live? Where did they have housing? And the answer was right next to the factory. But all three of these groups wanted the same thing. The mayors wanted it because they wanted to have people they could organize with politically, with their political parties, or with the city, which would, I won't go into details of each, but basically all three for different reasons supported nearby workers with factories. The most important were probably the Social Democrats, it's the most important Marxist party in the world, founded, decades before the Russians or the Chinese. And so the Social Democratic Party said, yes, we want workers to be there because we want to organize them. We want to be able to have in our unions. And so you had through the 20th century, union organized vacations. You would take everybody from the same town, the same union, you take them to a beach, you take them to a vacation home. So you take them to activities where the union would continually keep people working under the union, even on vacation time, and so that was the ideal, that you wouldn't have people getting conflicting images. The framing, each of them thought they could frame the situation to dominate their view and dominate the political system. Okay. Let's go down to the next one, please. Okay, so here we have, let's see, really civic organizations. These were really in varied the first column is the general political system. So you had civic organizations which emerged. Now let's just flash up for a second. So varied is what it says. These were in terms of the social background and tightness, the principle, the incentives. There were many different kinds of civic organizations. So the most classic organization, so the internal organization, the most classic organization had officers, membership cards, fees, dues. So in the strong case of let's say the Sierra Club or an environmentalist, that is, why am I choosing environmental? There are more people who pay dues and who are members of the Sierra Club in the US than there are of both political parties combined. And American citizens contribute more money in the last 20, 30 years to environmental groups than they do to both political parties combined. Most people don't realize that. Same is true in England. There's a bird and other sort of nature organizations. You add those up and they have more money than all the British parties. So civic groups are very important, and they're closer to citizens, which is why we explored this, because there was interest by the Chinese. The Chinese were not ready to have election of the national government. They do have local elections in China today in the smaller towns, villages and so forth, but not for the national government. Nevertheless, China has arguably moved, and this is a controversial statement, but let's say over 50 years, has moved in a very strong democratizing direction in terms of more professional training, more people who have higher education, more social media, all kinds of things. These are pressures toward democratization. So how can the national government or big local governments respond in some way without having elections? And one answer is to try to use civic organizations of different sorts and then connect these with other activities. And so the point is there with China is that these are not products of capitalism. These are not products of the general political system at all. You can find them in all different sorts of national and local contexts, even though the specifics will vary. I mentioned briefly that the Italian mayor of Florence used her political party to create ostensibly an independent environmental organization. They would hold meetings, they would hold protests, they would hold demonstrations, but they really were her party people leading them. And so this is what some of the best research on the subtleties of new social movements came from, was studying patterns like this, which implicitly, as you can see, assumed or a strong party background and clientelistic rules of the game, which I'm separating out and say you may, but you don't have to have that necessarily. They're different kinds of civic organizations. Let's scroll down one more. And we have here, so wait, yeah, we got, I think we lost, did we lose one just at the end? Yeah, what's here, this is, political parties. All right, political parties are usually varied in structure, but they're usually national, state-oriented more than being local. Canada and Australia are to some degree exceptions, that they have very strong local parties. And of course, Switzerland has communal. Switzerland doesn't even have a nation, it's a confederation of communes. And they have many local parties, although there are national parties as well. But political parties obviously compete for these other kinds of action groups. And they tend to have, some are based very much on, and say we are a class party or we are a work-based party. Others do not say that. The Christian democratic parties of Germany and Italy, for instance, would see the church as the guide for the organization. Even though the parties got stronger and stronger, they had the name of the church included because of the popular salience, especially in southern Italy, of the church. Still, this was in most of the world is a strict hierarchy within the parties, and the Roberto Michel's book called Political Parties is the most famous case that Lipset spent most of his career challenging and looking for ways that you could develop both within unions and then within parties more democratic activities than Michel said was possible. Max Weber to some degree, but Michel's more made the strong argument, if you have political parties, you don't get opposition. You just get domination by the party of its members. The leadership patterns tend to be general, especially in two-party systems. And again, you have, that is, these were traditionally not issue specific, which we discussed below. And the same kinds of things in the last column: newsletters, open and closed media, etc. Okay, next one, please. All right, here we have in the 1970s, the new social movements, and that's what we started with in Florence that I mentioned. This was Jane Byrne. This was these all continue, and you know them reasonably well. These are more common in post-industrial political systems with more higher education, and they're often national. Often these new social movements for women, for say the Sierra Club, for gays, these are often national new social movements. They're not city specific usually, although there may be branches within the city. They tend to be organized less around work and more about consumption and lifestyle. Big, very important issue. So as the Chinese economy is shifting away from being export, work, production oriented, and instead is focusing more on domestic consumption lifestyle, that's why they're bringing in new plans in the 5-year plan and supporting all kinds of things that move in this direction. Even if you can have tough hierarchical party in recent, say in the last 10 years, a movement in the more higher, in some respects, in terms of less civil liberties, less human rights, and less individual autonomy. Nevertheless, the longer term, we have all this going on within China as we do within the US and within France. So the internal organizations tend to be coherent but flexible in that they can change. Okay, here's a big point. These tend to be issue specific, chosen by the individual participants. I'm reading on down because these are, okay. Well, I don't want to go too far. But so the issue, what's issue specificity? A very critical concept we talked about. Where did it come from, and where was that term used first in this course? It's a required book reading, not by Terry Clark. Hint. What's the required book and its author? You all should know this. Robert Dahl, Who Governs? His big point is that politics is, we have both kinds. We have general party politics and we have issue specificity. And that rather than looking for a business elite, as Hunter and other earlier analysts of American city politics, and there are not many studies around the world compared to the US, but the the main focus of the vast majority of the 166 case studies that were from mostly the 1930s up to the 70s and so forth were studies that followed Floyd Hunter, C. Wright Mills. There was a business elite, and the business elite dominated in loosely Marxist way. They all changed gradually. C. Wright Mills did more. He wrote about the proletariat as the new proletariat as students. Floyd Hunter did not, and many of the local studies followed this business dominance pattern. And then, of course, with Clarence Stone, he wrote about Atlanta in a looser leadership kind of way. But he still saw business leadership as the key player. Dahl said, of course, no, politics is to some degree autonomous. And the political leaders differ according to, and the civic leaders differ by issue area. And so if you study mayoral elections, you find one thing. You study urban development, you find that business is more important. Banks, people who own the land, etc. They're more active in urban development. They're developers who give lots of contributions to the political leaders who try to have influence on the political system. But so do the African Americans, so do ethnic groups, so do others, etc. Whoops, we're losing some. Oh, here, okay, here we are. So issue specificity opens a huge door, and it's where the new social movements came in, talking not about the left or the Democratic Party. They talked about women, the environment, human rights, gays, lesbians, diversity, or basically these kinds of groups. And so this is highly salient with the Black Lives Matter presentations, which you're familiar with, and the other diversity groups and the like. Let me just add an example of how Chicago is different, even if we have official diversity groups like women. The most important national organization couple of decades back was NOW, the National Organization for Women. And to try to get data about these as we were doing comparative studies nationally, I wrote to the NOW organization, I wrote to the Sierra Club, I wrote to some unions and others, phoned them, tried to get data on their local members and activities. You know, how many members of the Sierra Club are there in different cities around the country? So we got data from the Sierra Club and nobody else. So as we couldn't get the National Organization for Women to do anything, to give us any data, so I invited many of these people to classes so we could get their words about how things worked, at least more qualitatively. Let me give you a few qualitative examples from the president of the Chicago National Organization for Women. We have it all tape recorded if you want. What did she say? What did I ask? So she came in and she had a little presentation, 5-10 minutes to introduce herself. And she said, the most important thing I want to say about our Chicago organization is that we answer every inquiry, every phone call, everything that people ask us from each constituent. We respond to them, to that constituent. She then went on and elaborated this in various ways. And I said, hey, that sounds like clientelism. You have people who go to the precinct captain or the ward committeeman, and they say, you know, my son's having trouble in school. He got arrested. He's now in jail. Could you help me get him out? That individual request for personal, private assistance is the driver of clientelist politics, especially in Chicago, but you know, in Italy and in Ireland, etc., China in the past. After about half an hour of this, I said, you know, as I read some of the national activities and publications of the National Organization for Women, they talk about women's rights, identity, changing gender roles, and things like this, which are not answering phone calls or requests. Are these important for you in Chicago? What did she say? Who's read a little bit, or I wouldn't say read, who's heard any kind of feminist discussion? What I just said, gender specificity, the gender roles, identity, these are classic in most diversity activities for gays, for women's, for environmentalists, and so forth. She didn't say that at all. So I asked her the question, and she said, no, that's what they do in Washington. We don't do that here. I was amazed, and maybe some of you are too. But it shows how the clientelist template of Chicago Irish white Catholic politics had so come to dominate how you do anything in Chicago that the National Organization for Women did the same thing as the mayor of Florence did, who had her people from the Socialist Party join and participate. So I'm not saying that there were so Jane Byrne did things like this. I'll just add, when she was co-chair under Daley, just to show you, well, I don't want to go too far. Let's go down to the end, and then we'll go back and forth a bit more. So we have here the new social movements. Then we have the next, the new social movements. 2 words there. Here what we have is the same kinds of things that were found before, but simply more of them, more higher education, more technical communication. Cell phones are coming in, social media and the like, national and local. And we have a focus on lifestyle, such as gays, highly voluntary, volatile in terms of the specific organizational practices. And the patterns are really individualistic, ad hoc in focus. So often there may be a charitable or symbolic food and anti-globalization program that is there. But the specifics are highly unpredictable, highly autonomous. Instead of even the new social movements like the National Organization for Women of the Sierra Club, they would have dues. You could have a card. I'm a Sierra Club member. Yeah, I paid $200, whatever. And I'll just add as well, the average Sierra Club member is a member of 7 other environmental organizations. 7. So these are powerful, important, interconnected officially. In addition to that, we have loose environmental organizations where people on a block may get together and just chat and say, let's start some recycling, but they don't have any organizational saying you should do that. So we have instead texting, iPhones, cell phones, blogs, Facebook, people liking each other, but not saying we're members of an official organization. That's what makes these new social movements. I invented this label because almost nobody writes about this. You know, I was amazed. So I told you, we could try to show, or take a look yourself if you want, on some of the other later things, like the Wall Street, the Wall Street, and then the Chicago, and there's hundreds of other cities that had similar kinds of demonstrations. Seattle was even before Wall Street. These were the beginnings of the new social movements. You had this. People came from political parties, they came from unions, they came from new social movements like environmentalists, but nobody was in charge. There was no coherence holding everything together. And so the police didn't know who to arrest or how to organize it. And we have a case study in here of how we had something like this in a big Chinese city. That there was a big environmental risky plant that was going to be built that would pollute the whole area of the entire big city. The environmental organization did nothing. The official organization, they were too close to the Communist Party and too much controlled by it. However, people in the city just talked to each other, and there were increasing numbers of demonstrations against it, and just discussions informally. Finally, there was and it was all peaceful. Finally, there was a march, and they just marched. And where did they march? because they didn't have any leader, nobody saying where we will march, the police helped them coordinate themselves. Not in a way of we want to arrest you, because the police basically favored the organization. The policemen were local. They didn't want the factory either. And so we had a sympathetic set of police. And there was one day of a totally peaceful demonstration. People walked all around and protested visibly, hundreds of thousands of them. Or I shouldn't say hundreds, something like 100,000, but large numbers, visibly protesting the mayor. And the policy was backed by the mayor, by the national government, the Ministry of Economic Development. They all said, we need this factory for China. And the local people said, no, this is dangerous. We don't want this, et cetera. And the people won. So it was an example of a new social movement triumphing, even though the official main local environmental organization did nothing. Okay, so these things can emerge even in, I'm using these dramatic exceptions to what we would normally think and read about to show that these things can be combined in many different areas. Jean Lin, who was a co-author of the book, did her PhD on she was a journalist for about 5 years before she came here for the PhD program. And she covered environmental movements in mainland China. And so she went all around, she found dozens of these of all different sorts. And then she tried to make sense of them using a range of different kinds of data with Ding Jing Zhao and me and political science. And she was a teaching assistant in this course several times. Okay, let me go down to the next. Sorry, the next big model we have of an ideal type we call scenes, and you've read about this in Scenescapes. I made a presentation on it that I won't repeat, except to point out how it contrasts with but does not replace. Scenes do not replace all these other things that go all the way back to the feudal era. And the feudal era, of course, is narrowly European. If we were dealing more systematically with India or China, we could add a lot more, which in different areas of China or India may be far more important, like the axial religions of Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, and the like. They all started about the same time as Christianity, and they all brought some degree of morality at least into the religion, and although it didn't get into politics until later on. But the scenes, what I'm pointing out here, similar. You can compare scenes in terms of, in a sense, you can read these as propositions. I wouldn't say they're partly definitional, but they're also propositional in the sense that these are not deterministic. It's not as if I'm not saying what Marx said. When you move from the feudal era to industry, feudalism is dead. He didn't quite say that, but he implicitly was saying these historic periods have their own rules of the game, and if you stay with the older one, you will be crushed. And so the idea was that socialism must crush capitalism, and then communism must remain a militant military activity until it crushes capitalism in the entire world. That's the Leninist extension. Okay, so the scenes idea says, no, we can find these things in Chicago. We've got a big block of socialist party, made up, I think it's called a caucus. It's a socialist group in the Chicago City Council. It's important. Laurie Lightfoot draws heavily on their support. There's a black caucus in the Chicago City Council. Big, major. There are other kinds of caucuses and groups within cities, even within Chicago. And if we have this kind of diversity in the Chicago City Council, Of course, we've got more in places that don't have this kind of hierarchical strong party residue, which makes Chicago so unique. We're almost at the point where we could have some discussion. Let me call upon you. I'll have a bite to eat here and see if anybody has a question or two on this, especially Aaron. Are you there today? There's a red A.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you're our man whose MA is right on this topic, and you and I talked about these issues an email a week or two ago. You want to lead off with any reactions to this? As you're a very informed activist.
Yeah, sure. I thought that point that you had made about the membership numbers in the Sierra Club and the other environmental clubs being bigger than the political parties. And I do understand the point about them being closer to the people. I think that's also a very valid point. But I was just wondering if there's sort of like a, does it really matter how big these groups are in some ways, just from the perspective of like, I don't know. I don't really think like the Sierra Club has much like impact on most of the members' lives in a direct way necessarily, like a social movement or a new social movement that we talked about, for example. So I was just wondering if like, I don't know. I think it's important, obviously, in certain ways that they have bigger numbers, just on the basic point of that alone. But I kind of wonder if like these environmental groups and other groups like it that just kind of like gain membership just on a numbers basis like that. I wonder if there really isn't that much power there in reality, or in like technical, formal political power. I don't know. It's a little bit of a loose thought. I don't really have necessarily like something super specific to talk about besides that in that regard. Yeah, I do also want to say I did think that the point you made about how the action groups and other things of different political systems will persist past that political system's to be a little reductive demise, so to speak. I think that's a very important point, especially in these social relations, and the ways movements grow is often obviously that they take from historical moments and other examples. So I thought that was also really interesting. I think I've kind of made a big point and to do in other places I've talked to say I love the point of context matters, and I think that's just another way that context kind of matters here, is like you have to look at the historical remnants of past political systems to also have some information on what came after. Things rarely spontaneously just develop, I think. So that would kind of be like another broader point that I've kind of taken away from some of these discussions.
Okay, now these are important points, Saul. I mean, the big one you raised first, which I would not disagree with, but I would say it's but what we need to do to answer that kind of thing is to lay out some of the concepts of political impact, or true or real. I mean, you used a word like real or real power, or real, or then I think you said formal, such as being represented in the law. And if we lay out 3, 4, 5 of these, such as what's in the law, who's represented in the city council, amount of money raised and then contributed to political activities, laws passed. These are some of the kinds of things that people trying to conceptualize and then measure with available data. For a national government, you have US Congress studies, you have the British Parliament. So these things will change depending on the aspects. The legal structure may be highly variable. But if one tries to look for things to compare, money and jobs and support by citizens are things, each of which are important to study. So when we did the book on the new political culture, we laid out in 25 or so propositions that this pattern of fiscal caution, but more socially progressive issues is more likely if we have, and then we had four big boxes of the economy, the family and social arrangements, then cultural activities, then we had government. And so my simple point is if we try to build a framework like that, and we have each of these dimensions, what that framework does not say is one of these drives everything, or that one is necessarily more important. It says, take a look at this framework, and then based on one or another combination of variables or sets of variables, such as diversification or conflict as different competing or organizing principles, we can try to say how much impact does one of these have? Does one of these variables have? For instance, money, or just I can't avoid in building on your example also first of the Sierra Club, as that's what you mentioned. I mean, how much impact does the Sierra Club have? I was teaching an earlier version of a course of this course, and there was a guy there who had worked in the World Bank. He was a MAPS student here. He'd worked in the World Bank for about 25 years. He spent half his career, and he worked mostly in Africa and Latin America. So he helped them with the creation of environmental activities in their national laws, or they would create usually a ministry of the environment in Nigeria or in Kenya or in Argentina. And these came in the 1970s and 80s as the environment became a bigger issue around the world. And the World Bank, I think, probably gave more money if you would do things that were more environmentally friendly. So he was there in part as a representative of the World Bank, maybe making loans sometimes, but other times not. But he watched this happen, and he watched it country after country after country in Africa and Latin America. And so I asked in the class, is there any particular organization that may dominate this kind of thing? Because if you look at the literature called environmental studies or environmental research, many of the studies in the 60s and 70s and 80s on up to present have one answer. What's that answer? Who's the most important type of actor in affecting environmental policy in let's say world research, and especially there's lots more detailing this in the US. But the theory is pretty, does have a one-word answer for many, not all, but many. What's that word? Business. Business dominates the environment. And if you want the classic argument, if you want jobs, back business, back the Chamber of Commerce, and don't press for adding smokestacks that get cleaned up more. Don't press for more of these environmental. And so you have opposing that the environmental justice movement, which tries to be low income oriented, minority oriented, and environmental. But the theory of many of the environmental people, and I've been in conferences, national conferences right here. We have 8 people talking about where do we have environmental activities and so forth. And they'll say, oh, business. Okay, that was the background I had in mind. And when I asked the class, and then I turned to the guy from the World Bank and said, is there any particular type of actor who was most important in your field work? Because I mean, we don't have that much written up about the field work in Africa and Latin America. And he had a 2-word answer. Which kind of actor was most important? Or a 3-word actor? The Sierra Club. And I said, the Sierra Club in Africa, in Latin America? This is Sierra means the Western American mountains. Who knew that they had an international branch at all? And his answer was, I went to country after country after country. And when we had these initial meetings about how should we deal with the environment here in Africa or Latin America, people would come in and say, I'm the head of an activist movement. We ought to really do this. Yay. And so then the people would say, well, how would you put this in the Constitution? Or how can we build a law about this? Well, I'm not so sure. Other people would be from the media. Other people would be from a particular disadvantaged neighborhood. Other people would be minority groups. But the Sierra Club person who was there would say, well, I have a 200-page document which shows you how to do this in this country. I adapted it from what we've done in other countries, but it's prepared just for your country. And it shows you what you need to do to structure a ministry of the environment here in Sierra Leone, for instance. And so they came not only prepared, they had the legal, they'd done the legal homework. They'd spent their money because they had more money than anybody else. I'm not sure they had more than the World Bank, but they both had a lot of money, and they would show up deeply prepared, and they wanted strong focus on a strong environmental activity. Okay, I was knocked off my chair when I heard this, just as I was when I heard the woman from NOW Chicago. It's great to do, have classes where you have people come in. They can, you can be totally surprised in the classroom itself, and it's wonderful to learn this way. Okay, so that's one quick answer just to the Sierra Club. And of course, would the president of the Chicago Sierra Club, I think I'd heard about some of this before. And so I asked her, does the Sierra Club, does the National Organization for Women get involved in international activities? And she said, no, not very much. No, but then, okay, but I won't try to get too global. But my simple point is, depending on how you which piece or pieces of this bigger framework you want to work on or identify as more salient. And I'm using the example of the new political culture. Let me just finish that example. We in the first book called The New Political Culture, we have 25 propositions. We then wrote about 9 more books. One was on citizens, and one was just really citizen preferences, surveys of citizens, so forth. Another was on local governments called Urban Innovation. Another one was on class politics with Marty Lipset. How much does class change with the new political culture? Another was on putting these pieces together, and that became then Kentuckville Karaoke. That is, we've talked about that already. And then after that came Scenescapes. But my point is, each of these came from digging a little deeper and not saying, we only want to study this, or only this is important or more important. It came from, as you've just seen today in this listing of these kinds of activities, all of these can be important, but how important and why is a critical question. So for instance, one big factor, Daniel Elazar worked for some years in trying to put this together in a global framework. He died before we could finish it, and it was never published. But we have bits of it in these works that I'm giving to you. And if you look at, for example, trying to get a quick, easy, communicable example. How important is the environment? If you ask citizens, how important is supporting the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or the British Labour Party, or the German Social Democratic, but how important is that compared to the environment? More and more people are answering in terms of issue specificity. The environment, yes, is the number one in terms of all these groups. It's the environment is the biggest. in terms of citizen surveys, as well as in money raised. You're asking the question, what was the impact? If we look at the laws, it depends. It depends. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's zero. But so that is your question is an excellent one in the sense that it can be generalized for the whole course. Now, how can we assess the importance of anything that you'll be working on in the next 5 or 10 years or thinking about? And in general, I wouldn't look for, even though I gave you 2 examples which are misleading, I gave them because they are misleading, business and the Sierra Club. It's misleading in general, even though it may not be misleading in Africa or that is, it's misleading in the sense that it was not an organization meant to be African or Latin American or global. It was meant to make, the Bay Area be more beautiful. Okay, the Sierra, and then California, and so that's where its name came from. All right, got 4 more minutes. Who else has questions? We could explore some of Aaron's, but I mean, he's as you can see, he's giving you challenges the way what I presented today does too. These are not final fixed one or right or wrong answers. These are things these are mechanisms for helping you see many things going on simultaneously. And if we're dealing, as say, we have 5,000 people, or I don't know, 30,000 people demonstrating in Chicago on, Occupy Chicago. What do they want? They all had different programs. They all had different things. That's why it was so that's why life is so complicated. But it's not that it's meaningless. It's not nil. We do not live in a nonsensical, just plain noisy world if we look more closely. And one way to do so is to look at distinct neighborhoods like Bronzeville, or distinct organizations like NOW or the Sierra Club, and then see what they do and how these connect with a bigger scene. Who else? Charlotte, are you there? You there still?
Hi, yes, how are you?
Just fine. You want to ask a question or comment?
Yeah, I do actually have a question. I was just looking through my notes. So towards the end, you mentioned the scenes and you said that they contrast with, but don't replace something going back to the feudal era with what we've been talking about. And I'm kind of struggling to see the connection there. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because then you were talking about the socialist group in the Chicago City Council and the Black Caucus. And I'm having problems sort of putting that together.
The scene is complicated in the sense that it can be used as a term or a concept to analyze the Chicago City Council and the Occupy movement in the streets. Those are both scenes. And so if we look for the dimensions of scenes, and we have the comparative quantitative data for all the US zip codes and Canadian. We also have about 100 mini case studies like a city council and like extreme versions. So the point of this is look at the framework of scenes, and you can see how some of those ideas connect with this. But the scenes book and the scenes analysis does not say there is no class. There's no class voting. There is no ethnic voting. Ethnicity is still here. But ethnic politics is only one piece of many other things. I'm trying to give you a clear, specific answer to your question. That's the first version. I can go on, but you want to come back with anything? So you mentioned a couple of examples. I said the city council. What was the other one you had?
The Black Caucus and the City Council and the Socialist Caucus.
Yeah, oh, sure. So within the City Council of Chicago today, we have those caucuses. And we have them nationally within the Democratic Party and of course, civic groups. And then this book even makes the point that within organizations like the Sierra Club or like the Ford Foundation or like the MacArthur Foundation, you've got some activists. You've also got some bureaucrats. You've got some people who want to be professional foundation folks for the rest of their lives. You've got some patriarchs who want to dominate and have the name of their foundation be salient, but they want to connect with hot things. And each of these lead foundations, the big foundations, which are major participants in a lot of these kinds of civic activities. In a sense, these are the American version of the strong party in Europe or China or elsewhere. So my point is, within an organization where I've had internships, I've had former students from here, like Toni Preckwinkle. She was a student of mine. She got me involved. So I sit now. I'm an advisor to one alderman. And I'm an advisor on I previously was an advisor for Tony for what was called a TIFF. It's a tax increment financing organization. So it decided it was a quasi-civic group, but connected in advising the alderman, just as we're now developing a Bronzeville Welcoming Center. And we potentially can get money from foundations, from the city government, from the national government, from others, and no one person is going to dominate this. No one source of funding or nobody's single imprimatur. And the alderman explicitly, she's a compromiser. She wants to build a compromise. She doesn't just want Black Lives Matter rhetoric. She doesn't just want something against it. She doesn't want the police alone. She wants all these to be involved in an appropriate way. And they're all part of Black culture, for example. Okay, we're at the end of our hour. We will stay on for office hours for a little bit for those of you who like. And next Monday, we will have the review session for the midterm, and Wednesday will be the exam. So, and plus there's a session, I think one of you, was it Sharon, you announced that your session is Friday?
Yeah.
Okay, want to just mention that again, or how students can connect to that?
Sure, I have emailed the class about my office hours.
Okay, so you got an email via, just speak a little louder, an email via Canvas that lists the Zoom address.
Yes.
For your session Friday at what time?
3 p.m. to 5 p.m.
Three
No
to
need
5.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And Abhishek should be doing the same. But stay on right now if you have something you want to raise, and we will continue as discussed.